Look around some more. Just know you're going on the pile and get yourself out on the wall. Just know you're going on the pile.
It's like, there's a wealth of riches to talk about. Too many things. There's a paradox when we feel overwhelmed. How do you think the average person is dealing with this moment? Because on one hand, I'm profoundly disappointed in the American people. But on the other hand, I can understand why so many of them are in this state of learned helplessness and they're watching something they can't possibly believe happen right in front of them. They don't know what to do.
I think there's a level of anxiety that is created when there's so much shitty stuff happening at once. I think for most of us who consider ourselves progressives or radical, we're used to being frustrated by national politics, and we're used to people letting us down, and we're used to people doing things that piss us off. But it's usually a couple of things at once, and it's stuff that's predictable.
Here's an example. I'm sure you thought a lot about this. It's a question of moral and ethical leadership. And I don't know why there aren't editorials every day in the newspaper. There aren't folks on TV talking about this. The wanton cruelty to all the folks, predominantly black and brown, because we're not talking about the black folks who are being kicked out of the country too, by these ICE agents, taking people out of hospital beds, harassing people on buses, hiding at courthouses. And history is not going to judge this country well, because the thing that troubles me, among many things, is, but very often it's because someone, dropped a dime on them. It's a neighbor. It's somebody in their community. And that sort of cruelty to strangers, that hints at a deep, deep, deep cultural sickness. And I keep telling folks this is going to get so bad before it gets worse. And folks, like I said, I'm frustrated. People don't want to hear it. They're in profound denial.
I think you're right. A couple months back, I did a show on my podcast of immigration, and the conversation that I had with Tia Oso that day, we were talking about this, that it wasn't enough to be sort of, someone who believes, we just need, we need secure borders. I mean, I've known people who take that position, right, who are still compassionate. I think they're wrong, but they're compassionate human beings. And you can almost sense that to some extent, every now and then they'll feel bad about the fact that they want to have more they may be faking it. I mean, who knows? It could be shitting me, but it seems like, God, it'd be great if we could let everybody in, but we just don't have the resources and we just can't But people aren't even faking that now is the problem. And that's what speaks to that cruelty. There is this almost gleeful way in which the current culture is being abusive and cruel and callous to people simply because of their documentation status and really because of their ethnicity. I mean, when Ann Coulter talks about immigration, she does so with a vitriol that is not necessary to make the policy point, right? You don't have to be an asshole to have that position. I mean, I think if you have that position, you are sort of an asshole ethically, but you don't have to act like one. Still be the kind of person that says, hey, you know what? We're not going to rip families apart. Do this. We're not going to sit there, tweet how great it is and talk, chanting at children. I'm sure you've seen these stories, where the middle school basketball games and you've got middle school, junior high kids and they're chanting at them, build the wall, build the wall. I mean, and it's like you said, that's not about a policy dispute. That is about a kind of cruelty and hyper-nationalism, which has only in history led to utter disaster.
Is that we have the technical language. We can talk about social dominance, behavior, racial authoritarianism. We can make the allusions to history, the past, the present. But again, it's always clouded by American exceptionalism. Never forget, America's a country that lynched tens of thousands of black people. Stole land from First Nations folks. Never mind land dispossession for other folks. Practiced ethnic cleansing. Hell, we're a country where the Nazis studied Jim Crow and said it was too extreme. So this pulses through our country's blood, our collective subconscious. And you think about Trump and his public, everything we know about the public opinion data, the other research about them, and folks say this is strong. There was some recent research, I'm sure you saw it, about the quote-unquote alt-right, that they manifest the dark triad of personality traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And you've got a leader that reflects that, and you've got a public. Hey, these folks are only restrained by some basic norms of behavior. Now, if they start getting even more cues, and I'm not just including the white supremacists who are in Charlottesville and elsewhere, I'm talking about rank and file Trump right-wing voters, the gun nuts, the homosexuals. We don't know how this ends, or maybe we do know how it ends, and that's what scares people.
Back in 2010 or 2011, when I wrote Dear White America, obviously I didn't foresee Trump, but it was during the time of the Tea Party. And I remember making this argument to whomever would listen. And a lot of people did not want to listen. But the idea that there's going to come a point when some of these folks realize that their electoral futures are dimming because of cultural change, demographic change, the fact that young people are increasingly turning against the sort of evangelical religion that drives a lot of people to the right, all that stuff. And when they figure that out, they are going to do one of two things. And one is very unlikely. That is, go gracefully into the good night, be peaceful about it, or they're going to reach for the guns, which they have in abundance. I mean, 3% of the population has 50% of the weapons, and I don't have to tell you who those people are.
The majority of them are white men who are conservative.
Overwhelming. So that's number one, right? And I think the point you just made, too, about the importance of understanding the connection to and the mythology of American exceptionalism is very critical, because the reason people don't think that it can ever get as bad as you and I are both alluding to it potentially getting is because they really still cling to that notion of exceptionalism. And in part, it is because, and it has been frightening for me to see how common this is when I travel the country and I speak to college students. And I'm talking about, these are students who, these schools are, these are quote unquote good schools where there are standards for admission, I presume, that are pretty hefty. And yet these are students who oftentimes, through no fault of their own, I blame the K-12 system from which they came and the parents from which they came, frankly, they don't have a context. They have no sense of the history that you just in 15 seconds rattled off, the history of lynching, the history of land theft, the history and Jim Crow. The term Jim Crow is something that you literally have to explain to people under the age of 25 nowadays. So even when Michelle Alexander talks about the new Jim Crow, there are people that don't know what the old Jim Crow was. And I find myself having to actually explain concept to college students who have never learned these things. So if I've never learned about mass lynchings, if I've never learned, as you pointed out, that the Nazis actually studied our race, quote unquote, hygiene laws, our eugenic sterilization program laws, our forms of segregation, and learned from us, if they haven't learned that, and they haven't, then they are able to believe, well, yeah, things are bad, but they can't ever get like that because we're America.
When you read some of the commentaries about Trump in this moment and racism and white supremacy, resurgent violence, you're going out there on the road actually talking to folks. What do you think some commentators on these topics that we both care about, human rights and human dignity, what do you think they're doing well and what do you think they can do better? So I'll throw one out there. I'm increasingly frustrated because I just think it's piss poor writing, where folks practice what I call garden variety racism chasing. So they pick out some bad example of something bad, but they don't connect the dots to talk about systems and institutions and give a little history lesson. So it's this thing, oh my God, outrage, outrage, outrage. But if you're just pointing out the low-hanging fruit and not looking at the big picture, I worry that you're doing a disservice.
I've seen that very same phenomena. And what I've been trying to talk about in the last 6 months or so, really ever since Trump, is trying to one overarching point. And that is, yes, we certainly need to be concerned about the upsurge in overtly racist, white supremacist, white nationalist, fascist political behavior and violence, and the 23% increase in hate crimes that happened in that first year of Trump's presidency. However, my big concern is that when we focus on that and when the media focuses on that to the exclusion of either connecting the dots or even talking about systems and things at all, I fear that it lets the rest of us almost entirely off the hook. We get to get distance from those people. And so people can cluck their tongues about Charlottesville. And, oh my God, wasn't that terrible? And that's just awful. And yet we don't necessarily realize, as I try to point out in my talks, David Duke and Richard Spencer and Matt Heimbach, these fools, they're not responsible for the fact that black folks are 3.5 times more likely than white folks to be shot while unarmed and posing no threat to police. They're not in charge of the lending system and the wealth creation system that allows, white families on average to have 15 times greater net worth than black families. That's the result of a history